Welcome to a short slide presentation on art from around the world. As you went through the overview of what we're going to be looking at in class, I assume some of you might have wondered, what about the rest of the world once we get into the art of Europe, Greece, and Rome? Because as we will see, during that time there was a vibrant explosion in the arts happening throughout the world. Now, because of time constraints, we're only going to be able to spend 1 week on art from the rest of the world. So in this slide presentation here, I'm going to just provide a brief introduction and overview that might be of interest to you. First, let's start with Easter Islands. Now, these are mysterious heads that were built on remote islands near New Zealand sometime between 1000 and 1500. We don't really know why they were built, like much of the ancient art, because the people who created them were prehistoric, and prehistoric simply means before written language. Now we're going to pop over to India, where we have a dancing Shiva. And this is from about the same time period as the Easter Island sculptures, and also it's the same time period as what we call the Middle Ages in Europe. Now, during this time, when Europe was sort of in some ways in a stagnated phase, southern India was vibrant and was in a time of great learning. They had hospitals with very sophisticated medical techniques in their belief system of the Ayurvedic system. They had libraries. They were very advanced for their time. So here's one more piece of art from that time period, and then we'll pop over to look at China. Now, these are known as the terracotta warriors in China, and they were made in about the year 300 BC. These are spectacular because they're made of clay, and they are nearly life-size. They're about 5 feet tall. Now, if any of you have worked in clay, you might know that to fire it, there's a little bit of a trick to it. They have to be hollow on the inside and really not more than 1 inch thick. So these represent a great mastery of the art of working in clay. And just to give you the scope of how many, these are the terracotta warriors, where they're housed in China. Now we're going to jump over to North America. This is from the Hopewell tradition. We're going to look a little bit at North American art in the prehistoric section next week, but I wanted to be sure and touch on that during this overview also. The Hopewell lived along the Mississippi River, and they were very active from about 200 or 300 BC up until about 700 AD. Now, they were great traders. They traded all over the country. We have evidence of that. And they created really beautiful works of art. We'll do one more piece from the Mississippi tradition, and this is called a head pot. It's an effigy from around the same time period. And as you can see, they're very sophisticated in their level of creative ability. Okay, now we're going to do one image to represent all of the artwork from Central and South America, which really does a disservice to this wealth of creative expression, mostly from the Mayan tradition, if we're considering the ancient world. This is from Chichen Itza in Mexico, and was created just after the turn of the millennium, again during what we call the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages in Europe. Now we'll jump over to, well, let's return to China for just a minute with this image on the left, because it's an example of a silk painting from the same time, from about 1000 AD. And I find it just really moving because the way that the artist works with the immediacy of the brush and creates this feeling of atmosphere when they're actually painting on silk. The image on the right is from Japan, from just after the turn of the millennium, the first 1000 years of the current of AD, after the current era. So this is very interesting to me because it's a Buddhist monk, and if you can see on the slide, it's kind of amusing because he has all these little Buddhas coming out of his mouth. And as I understand it, in that tradition, they repeat a sacred phrase or the name, an aspect of the Buddha over and over again. And this artist has taken that very literally and actually had the Buddhas coming out of the mouth of this monk. So this is one pious monk. He's really doing his practices with full attention. So we're going to look at one more work from Africa. And we will take some time to look further at African art. We'll look more at all of this art when we get into our lesson on non-Western art. But this one in particular I wanted to show to all of you because it's the great mosque at Djenne. And this was built completely of mud. It was built sometime between the 8th century and the 10th century. It was built over a period of a couple of hundred years. So consider that this great work is completely out of mud in the middle of the desert. Now you might see all those little dots in the side of it. Well, let's take a closer look at those because they are quite fascinating. How in the world would you keep something like that from melting in the monsoon or from cracking and falling apart in the heat? Well, this is how they do it. These pieces of wood are actually permanent scaffolds that are built into the site. They were installed when it was built, and now there's regular community events where the people will come and re-stucco the side of the mosque. Now lastly, for this presentation, we'll look at the interior of the mosque at Cordoba in Spain. One of the things that some people don't realize is that there was a time in the late part of like coming up into 1000 to 1200 AD when Jewish, Christian, and Muslims lived together in harmony in southern Spain. And this was a time of great advancements in the arts, and time, you know, maybe they lived separately, maybe there was a little bit of tension, but as we look at our world today, it's important to remember that there have been conflicts throughout history, but there's also been times when societies did live together peacefully and that the arts flourished as a result. Now, throughout all of these images, we've talked a lot about it sort of from a religious perspective, and I want to mention that we will also look at Jewish art in this context of one of our chapters during this semester. But that's because the reason that we look at it from a sort of a religious perspective for the first 1500 years of this millennium is because most of the art was created in a religious context. The idea of the artist as individual doing self-expression, it simply didn't exist in most societies. So if the artist was to create art, it would be for religious purposes or maybe for some sort of to influence others as a sort of a propaganda. But the artists didn't really act on their own behalf to simply express themselves through art in these ancient times. So this completes our overview of the rest of the world, and I'm going to tell you, I know I've met some major pieces out because it's simply as time and space allows. So thanks for listening.